Hello, I'm Otis from They Naive, and welcome to the workshop, located in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We've had the CNC machine for a few months now, and I really need to solve the dust collection problem. This machine creates a ton of dust, and it's annoying having to stand by the machine with a vacuum cleaner while it does its thing. So I had this idea. What if I made a system where the hose follows the spindle of the CNC around on a couple carriages that would function as an X and Y axes, just like the CNC. And these carriages would have pulleys that ride smoothly on tracks. The first order of things was to have some beams that would span the width of the room to which the rest of the contraption would be attached to. I had some 2x4s salvaged from another project, and I glued them in pairs to make material thick enough to withstand the span of the room without sagging too much in the middle. And this was the next day, and the beams magically got installed, and I totally didn't drop one of them on the CNC's electronics cabinet. Anyway, they need to be level to the earth, so I cut some shims and got at it. I then marked out where the cross members went, and these will make sure that the two main beams have a consistent spacing. I set up some scraps to support the cross member while screwing it in. I rinsed and repeated for the rest of the cross members, and we have the main structure finished. Another day, another set of dungarees. The first carriage, aka the Y-axis, will run on some pulleys I 3D printed, and now I am milling the tracks onto which these are gonna run. Something I forgot to mention is that I didn't want to buy anything for this project. I could have easily bought some barn door hardware, some proper pulleys and tracks, everything metal, but in the end the only thing I had to buy for this project were the nuts, bolts and washers that the bearings slide on, and the rest I had in the workshop or made myself. Here you can see how this is gonna work. I sanded the tracks smooth, and then marked and drilled mounting holes. So, since I knew the beams were gonna sag a little in the middle, I was checking for level as I installed the tracks. Installing the tracks on the other side was a bit uncomfortable, but I managed. Then I measured what the span between tracks was, and I figured out exactly how wide the Y-axis carriage needed to be. I made it as light as possible using some 1x2 material and screwing it together. It's just a stick frame, basically. I milled the pieces that connect the carriage to the pulleys on the CNC, and you can see why a CNC needs dust collection. I used tabs as hold downs and cut the pieces free with the jigsaw and a lot of finesse, and put the scrap piece away where I keep my emotions. And after a bit of cleanup, I got them installed on the stick frame. The pulley has a bearing in the middle, and I use 5 washers to set it the right distance apart from the connector piece. And I could finally try getting it up there for the first time. The fact that the carriage has a bit of flex to it enables me to gently force it up. And after checking that everything was in its place, boom. Here's my friend Diego witnessing my joy. Holy shit. Yes! So I really wasn't sure if this was going to work at all until that moment, and I was so happy, and I played with it for a while until... Ooh, no. No. Yeah, I pushed it around a little too eagerly, and that piece broke right there because of that nut. I quickly screwed it back together with a scrap piece of wood, which turned out to be useless because I ended up cutting half of the carriage off, including that part. It just felt like it was a little too big. This introduced another problem, which was that now the piece was wide and narrow, which led to some pretty bad binding. Stiffen up. Need to stiffen that. And to solve that problem and make it stiffer, I screwed some cross members to it. And that seemed to do the trick. Before going any further, I wanted to see if the CNC was going to be able to move the hose around. And so I attached the hose to the carriage and hooked it to the spindle. It was working alright, but I had a few places where the connector pieces were rubbing against the tracks. So in some places it was the bolt next to the bearing that was rubbing, so I hugged some material away from the beams with a Forstner bit. Not the most elegant solution, but it worked alright. On the connector pieces, I hugged out some material with the jigsaw, which was way more elegant. I am French after all. I also put a bit of oil on the tracks and the beams anywhere there might be rubbing points. Aha! Yes! Easy! Now that the Y-axis carriage was moving smoothly, I could move on to the X-axis carriage. Only problem was my 3D printer broke and I couldn't print any more pulleys, so I had to figure out another way. I ended up going with the homemade barn door wheels that I milled on the CNC. This time, instead of tabs, I tried running a toolpath that would indicate me where to put screws to hold the piece down. And they needed to be recessed pretty deep below the surface. You'll see how that works in a minute. I didn't want tabs because I am machining wheels and I didn't want to clean them up by hand and potentially ruin them. I could have cleaned tabs at the router table, but I cut off a bit of my finger last year at the router table and I kind of have a phobia of them now. Here you see why the screws needed to be recessed this deep and how convenient it is to be able to pull out the wheels and they're essentially done. And I don't mind the screw holes for shop projects. And it seems like they're gonna work just fine. Next, I dug up some cedar that I will use as the tracks of the wheels. The 2x2s I was going to use as spacers were just as warped as the ones from earlier, so I clamped them down to the bench during glue up and used the cedar strips to ensure they got strengthened and flushed up. It worked out pretty well, and I proceeded to install them on the Y-axis carriage. Again, making sure it was level. Here you can see how the wheels run in the tracks. It's the same system as the Y-axis, it's just a different style. I was so relieved to see it working. I was very worried it wouldn't, and I didn't want to scrap the project. I was a solid 2 weeks in already. So to have the two axes working was a big milestone for me, and to make sure everything would run as smooth as possible, I took the time to disassemble all of the wheel assemblies to lubricate them and to replace the old bead down washers by new ones. I used a drop of CA glue on the outside nut as a thread locker, and I also sanded every little imperfection I could find and applied a mix of linseed oil and carnauba wax to all of the tracks. That made all the difference, and the movement was really smooth at this point. Next, I could turn my attention to the dust shoe. I was very lucky to find 4 extra bearings I had laying around, which were the same ones that the CNC uses. So I measured how much space I had to play with and set out to transfer the bearings' whole locations to a piece of wood, until I remembered I have a very precise robot that can do this better and faster than me. So I dug up the specifications of the bearings to figure out the dimensions and where the mounting holes needed to go, and machined it. I didn't quite get it on the first try, but I eyeballed that the bearing was off by 20 mil. The rod onto which the ride is 20 mil, so my instinct was telling me it made sense that I had misplaced it by that amount. And sure enough, I machined another one and it fit. Couldn't believe it. So here's the final design of the dust shoe, which I cut off camera on the CNC. There is this fixed element that has the bearings on it, and it acts as a sleeve, inside of which this piece can slide. The hose slides in, and I can loosen the whole thing and place it around the spindle. This bolt at the top of the dust shoe locks the dust hose in place and makes it so that the hose is pulled from above the spindle, not at the same level as the cutting head, and this screw secures it at the desired height. Now, this piece slides behind the dust shoe and spindle plate and hooks to both of them. A screw then pushes them together and they can move together. You can see how the spindle is free to move up and down. That bottom plate needed reinforcing, so I added a piece of plywood to the front. There's a bit of extra material here I need to get rid of as it collides with the structure of the machine. And since I know the system works, and since I need to take it apart anyways, I will add glue to all joints. So the dust shoe looks like it's gonna work, but it does need some bristles to really improve the suction. I'm making them out of some transparent plastic stuff I had in the shop. And here you can see my weird finger. I like it because it's gonna make me able to see the cutting as it takes place. And then I cut just about every 5 mil or so to create flexible bristles. I then lined the strips with the edge of the dust shoe, punched a hole, pre-drilled, and drove a screw until I had it all around. Time for the test cut, and I programmed the machine to cut a random shape with a deep recess just to create a lot of dust and see if it worked well. So here you can see that the suction was most effective on the parts that were located right to the right of the spindle. There is some dust in the ridges left of the part and none on the other side, and almost nothing in the pocket either, so I think that's really pretty good. I'm happy at least. The system also allows me to quickly and easily release the hose for a manual cleanup, as you can see in this amazing demonstration. Even with the dust boot located right of the spindle, I can still cut the full width of a plywood sheet. I can finally put the bolts back on. These make sure the carriage can't fall off the gantry. And here are some shots of the final thing working. It's got some resistance points here and there, as you can tell by the sudden movements of the carriage sometimes when it releases. But it's not that much, and most importantly, it's not happening directly on the spindle, which is what matters most to me. And it sucks up the dust and eases my work process, which is what I needed this whole thing for. I was really unsure of my ability to pull this off, as I've never done anything like it before. I learned a ton, and I think it's a pretty unique solution. At least I didn't find anything exactly like it on the internet while researching. If you liked this movie, please consider subscribing and supporting our work on Patreon. It would mean the world to us. Thank you and take care. Yeah, that'll do it.